Good afternoon and welcome to the Raisina Dialogues. I'm at the News9 Plus studio here and I'm joined by Ambassador Kanwal Sibal. Ambassador Sibal, welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Tell us about the import of this Raisina Dialogue 2023 March. How important is it in the shape of the emerging world order that's emerging right now as we speak?
A couple of things. One is that the Asian space was dominated by the Shangri-La Dialogue, and the Chinese had their own version. India, which is a major Asian power, and wants to be able to contribute to thinking on strategic issues in this part of the world and beyond, didn't have a forum in which the international experts, government people, academia, and other scholars could be invited to discuss a range of issues of interest to the international community, to our region, and to India. And this was started 8 years ago, this dialogue, and it has blossomed from year to year. It has now actually become an important dialogue on the international networking of policymakers and scholars. And you can see from the kind of attendance we have, the level at which countries are represented. Today, for example, we had the Quad meeting with the US and Japanese and Australian foreign ministers present. We've had ministers from the Gulf area, from West Asia, discussing the larger range of energy issues, energy-related issues, and the general situation in this part of the world, which is very important to us. We've had the Mexican foreign minister coming and making some very nuanced observations in a panel in which the European foreign policy chief, Borrell, was present. It was a very interesting dialogue in many ways. And then we had Foreign Minister Lavrov speaking on the occasion. So I think in terms of the value that this dialogue is bringing to the international community of experts and policymakers, with India at its center and as the convening power, actually in many ways gives us more prominence internationally. And in this case, although this was not directly related to the Raisina Dialogue, but it figured indirectly in some of the discussions, since we have now taken up the responsibility to be the voice of the Global South. So when we are now speaking and having already put on the table and on the agenda of the G20, and it is figures in the joint statement, the concerns of the Global South. So when in the Raisina Dialogue our representatives speak, then they in a certain way have more authority in terms of what they are saying. It's not India alone, but India as a voice of the developing world in general.
In fact, that was going to be my next question. You answered it about whether you see this as being 2023 as being the launch pad for India's leadership position for the Global South. A few months down the line, you have the G20 summit, and the Raisina Dialogue, in a sense, kind of marks the beginning of a year of diplomatic engagements, culminating in the G20 summit. Where do you see things heading out for us in the near term, in the next 20 years or so, whereas the Indian economy picks up strength as the country becomes more confident, economically resilient?
Few things. One is that since this Raisina Dialogue has come back to back with the G20 meetings, and therefore because of the presence of so many ministers at the G20 meeting, they could make themselves available also for the Raisina Dialogue. So to that extent, it gave greater depth to this dialogue in terms of participation. In other ways also, the manner in which we are using the G20 as a coming out party for us, like the Chinese did with the 2008 Olympics, is also something which has been well thought out by the government, that this opportunity should not be missed. and showcase India in all its dimensions, in all its diversities. And in the context of the attacks that we are getting from the Western media, essentially from the Anglo-Saxon world, not only the media, think tanks and everything else, we develop a counter narrative, a more positive counter narrative, and this helps in shaping that. Now, with regard to what may happen in 20 years, if you go by what the IMF and the World Bank and others are saying, that by 2030 we will be the third largest economy, which means we would have overtaken Germany. It'll be US, China, Japan, and India. We would have overtaken Japan also. So that puts us in a very different position in terms of our role, our global role. The fact that China today exerts so much influence on the global stage is on account of what? Because 30 years ago, they were like us. Now they're 4 to 5 times bigger economy, which means that they have far more resources at their disposal to conduct their foreign policy. And one result of that has been the Belt and Road Initiative, by which they have linked large parts of Latin America, Africa, ASEAN countries to the Chinese economy. And they have developed such huge economic ties with the United States, Europe, and everybody else. In other words, the rest of the world can't do without China. And therefore, unlike in the case of Russia and Ukraine, the confrontation that the West has with Russia cannot be carried to the same degree with China, because the effect of that on themselves would be very grave, unlike in the case of Russia. Now, if we are following that trajectory and become a 5 trillion, eventually $10 trillion economy, then we have more resources. We'll build up our economic strength. We'll be able to create networks, connectivity networks in a different version of the BRI. But we'll play to our strengths, not infrastructure, but in areas where we are good, IT, the digital world and things like that, pharmaceuticals. So that will then increase our international profile, which means that our voice will be heard more and more. And then hopefully, I'm not very optimistic, but if you have a 20-year time frame, why not? The international institutions will have to be reformed. They are no longer representative of the actual power sharing in the world, both economic and political. So the United Nations has to be reformed, UN Security Council has to be reformed, the World Bank has to be reformed, IMF has to be reformed, which then means a few things. One, that India can aspire to be on the high table. Number two, it will actually mean multipolarity. No single country being able to dominate, or a single combination of countries being able to dominate the globe and impose on them their priorities and their policies. So that will be the second thing. And the third thing would be that we would have changed the balance in Asia. Because the only country that can counter China and its hegemony and its ambitions is India. We are very big. Demographically, we are now, unfortunately, bigger than China. And if our economy becomes bigger, as it will, and our military strength increases, then I think there'll be a better redistribution of power within Asia. And our goal, that before you think of multipolarity in the world, we must have multipolarity in Asia. That will be fulfilled. And finally, I think, and we can take pride in this, because we have no baggage like the West has of colonialism, and we have no baggage like the Chinese have of undoing the humiliations of the last century, dominate the world, thinking in a hierarchical order. We are at the center of the universe. We have a heavenly mandate. And the issues of sovereignty, where they make artificial, untenable, illegal claims of sovereignty on other countries, even smaller ones like Bhutan. India has no history like that. Our mindset is not like that. Right. So I think when we say that we can be a force for good, I think the stronger we become, we will be a stronger force for good genuinely. Genuinely, because our innate thinking of living and let live is very important, unlike the Western world or the Semitic world, where power is drawn from a single entity, whether it is God, whether it is the Communist Party, whether it is this or that.
That's an interesting point of view, sir. Are you saying this is because of the fact that we've never had a unified empire, an Indian empire? The last Indian empire was more than 150 years back. And ever since, we've had very strong political parties, we have had a democracy, I mean, after the colonial rule. So the sense that we don't have the kind of history, the baggage of history that you mentioned, that the Russians have, for instance, or the Chinese have, does that actually work in our favor in the 21st century?
Yes, it does. Because at the end of the day, what is the world going to do? Live together or destroy each other? And if we go down the path that we are going, and we see already signs of it in the Ukraine conflict, that the two foremost nuclear powers are engaged in a process of escalation which we do not know how it will end. So you need a very different kind of thinking. And India can provide that different kind of thinking because of our culture. I mean, if we have, well, you say facetiously, we have a million gods, but let's say if we have a multiplicity of gods, then we are accustomed to understanding and accepting a multiplicity of views. That let each man, even if he feels passionately about certain ideas of his own, relating to his personal self and beliefs, let him have it. And not create situations where you say, no, my belief is superior and must therefore be imposed on your belief, whether it's political or religious or economic, like the market economy and stuff like that. I think we are well placed, provided, of course, we rise to a certain level and can play that kind of a role globally.
You mentioned this combination of countries early on. And what we're seeing right now in Europe is that the US is engaged in a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. And on the other hand, you have a proxy war in Asia with China and Taiwan. And these two countries, incidentally, have some kind of a quasi-alliance, Moscow and Beijing. Do you see this phenomenal alliance as kind of upsetting the new world order that the West kind of imagined for itself in, say, 1991?
Look, I've always had the view that there was never a world order. It was always a controlled disorder. Now, if you went by the idealism of the United Nations Charter, then you could have a world order. But there again, the major flaw was that there was inequality built into the Charter, where 5 major powers have the veto, which means that whatever they do cannot be held accountable for that because they'll veto it, which is why the United Nations Security Council doesn't function. So there's never been a world order. Secondly, from India's point of view, it's very important. Since 1974, as a democracy, we've been the most sanctioned country in the world by the West as a democracy. And this continued till 2005. Strategically, we were openly targeted on our capacity to build up our strategic defenses. In much of this period, what happened? Maoist, communist type dictatorship which rejected Western values was built up by the West, ignoring India as a democratic country. So today when they say it's democracy versus autocracy, I think they need to be reminded we were a democracy even then, but you build up autocracy. Now that that autocracy is challenging you, you see value in our democracy. But we were always one. So this business of the world order, I don't buy it. It's a controlled disorder because it's always very difficult for now 193 countries to always live together. But you have to create platforms where they can somehow manage to reduce their differences and find means of dealing with each other without conflict. They have been successful in some areas, not successful in some other areas. Now the talk is about not a new rules-based order. Now, the only rules that have been accepted by everyone are the rules enshrined in the UN Charter. And then there is international law. So what is this rules-based order, if not the UN Charter and international law? So why this vocabulary of rules-based order? One doesn't know whether these rules are universal, whether they have universal acceptance, whether there's a legal document signed by countries accepting these rules. Who are these rules made by, and how are they implemented? Are they implemented fairly and squarely in every case, or are they double standards? Or you decide what rules you're going to apply depending on whether the countries concerned are your friends or your allies. And frankly, I don't want to be polemical, but just as an argument, if you blow up the Nord Stream 1 and 2, it is according to which rules-based order, frankly.
I want to take your thoughts back to a very significant moment in our history, 20 years ago, when you were Foreign Secretary, and there was tremendous pressure on the government of the day, the NDA government led by Prime Minister Vajpayee, to deploy troops in support of the US invasion of Iraq. I'm told that a division of the Indian Army had been earmarked for the task, and they were almost deployed, but for some very significant debates that took place in the cabinet at that time in 2003. Could you just tell us what the backdrop is and how we came, how we arrived at that decision not to send troops?
Well, you know, since this was an illegal invasion, United States were very keen to get India on board to give it some kind of legitimacy, because we've always been seen as a voice of the developing world. Today we call it the global south, or the non-aligned world before that. And therefore, if India had come on board, then it would have seemed to the United States and its allies that it was a legitimate war. Number two, since the nuclear question was involved, and we were ourselves a target because of our nuclear weapons program. So I think, and we were always very vocal about nuclear disarmament and everything else. We were pushing this. So I think one of the side sort of considerations might also have been that India would be receptive to the idea that there was some illegitimate nuclear weapons program going on there. And if India also raised its voice against such moves by Iraq, then it'll strengthen their case that they were genuinely concerned about Iraq acquiring nuclear weapons and stuff like that. They tried very hard, and they dealt directly with the Defense Ministry. What you say just now about the Defense Ministry being more open and readying one division of troops, this and that, I had absolutely no idea of it officially, because it was never discussed. And the views of the External Affairs Ministry were never taken. And I analyzed it myself at that time, that since the Americans have, how should I say, they're very well integrated into our whole system, that they may have actually tried through the Defense Ministry to create a situation where the political decision makers could be pressed or persuaded to send a military contingent to Iraq. The Americans also tried to make it easy for us, saying that we will station your armed forces in an area where there is no actual violence on the ground. So therefore, you don't have to actually fight, but it'll be kind of burden sharing where you maintain peace in a quiet area, whereas the West can concentrate on fighting in the areas where there was terrorism and stuff. We said that we have a clear-cut policy that we will not take part in any peacekeeping operations unless they are approved by the United Nations, which was not the case with Iraq. So they moved a kind of a resolution in the United Nations, which was a very watered down version of what we actually wanted. It was not an approval. Came back to us with that, and we said, no, this doesn't constitute an approval. So we cannot, therefore, go against our well-considered, well-entrenched policy that we'll only take part in UN peacekeeping operations and not inject ourselves into a war zone which is not covered by any UN resolution. I had gone to the United States at that time. I met Wolfowitz, I met Condoleezza Rice, somebody else in the State Department, and I explained our position clearly. And I was told later on that I had been quite tough. And I said, no, I was not tough. I was just stating the position quite clearly as to what we can do, what we can't do. There were voices in the government. I wouldn't like to name names, but one mistake was committed by a very senior minister on his visit to Washington, giving them the impression that we may be ready to contribute troops. And when the meetings took place in the CCS, I was asked to speak, and I gave my viewpoint, and everybody agreed. But rather than saying a blunt no simply at the level of the government, then a way was found that we'll get an all-party resolution, so that when we say no, we can be more credible in saying the nation doesn't want it. Not only the government, but the opposition also doesn't want it. Therefore, the nation doesn't want it. So we had that resolution, which was passed. So that's the background.
What was the Prime Minister's role in all of this? I mean, what was his personal view on deploying troops?
My own feeling is he was not in favor. But one or two ministers were thinking much more about buying IOUs with the United States in the context of a future relationship, which we were intending to develop. But I have a feeling that Vajpayee was not fully on board. But at the same time, given the fact that we wanted to, mind you, we had already called the United States as a natural ally, and Vajpayee had said that. We didn't want to be blunt, and therefore we found this indirect way of saying that our hands are tied.
20 years later, how do you view that decision taken by us?
Very wise. Very wise. First of all, the Iraq invasion has done a lot to erode the credibility of the United States and Europe, Britain included. Even now it is thrown into the face of the Americans and the Europeans that you talk a lot about Ukraine and this and that, but what about Iraq? Every time is mentioned, apart from Iraq, of course.
So Foreign Minister Lavrov just mentioned that in his
that's
talk.
right.
He says that you can go 10,000 miles away in the name of national security, but here we can't deal with threats on our border.
So even otherwise, in so many other discussions, and it's not being anti-American or anything, but if you really deal with this issue objectively and intellectually and analyze it in a fair manner, then you cannot say that we never committed any wrong, we never violated the sovereignty of any country, but Russia is the first country in post-war history that has violated the sovereignty of an independent country. I mean, framing it like that doesn't sell. But coming back to what we discussed, I think that Iraq war and the exposure later on that it was a totally false operation. There were absolutely no nuclear weapons of any sort or chemical weapons on the ground. Uh, and General Powell, also was secretary later, said he was misled. Tony Blair says it was a mistake. But you can't destroy a country, hang its head of state, cause millions of casualties and refugees, and then leave that country into the throes of terrorism and say that it was a mistake. It's too easy. It's too easy. So I think that's a albatross around the neck of the Western world when it comes to dealing with Russia and Ukraine, because the rest of the world sees the total picture much more than they are able to see because their own geopolitics and passions are involved in this.
Do you also see this as a vindication of India's foreign policy, where we always seem to do the right thing? You know, we at the moment that the decision is taken, it seems to be the worst thing in the world, and then suddenly it kind of things
but you
work
see
in our favor. Obor is one
Look,
example.
if supposing we had gone and done this against all principles, against the UN Charter, how would we have defended our position today? Then we would have been bracketed with all these countries that went into a conflict without approvals, without international consensus. It was an illegal intervention, and we would have been accused of not doing our homework and having become part to an illegal action in a country which was always friendly to us, always friendly to us. Whatever the nature of the regime, I visited Iraq in 1986. He was vice president then, Saddam Hussein, but he was a real power behind the throne. Very friendly country, very large oil supplier to India, but and I think we were very wise. As regards other things we have done, well, I don't know. I think our handling of China in the initial years has cost us a lot. So it's not as if we haven't made mistakes.
Ambassador Sibal, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you.
That was Ambassador Kanwal Sibal in conversation with me at the Raisina Dialogue. Thank you.